Oh, by the way, 8 years after I gave that study to George W. Bush on presidential kids, I'm driving along in the car, and on the radio, I hear John F. Kennedy Jr.'s airplane has disappeared over the Atlantic. I had chills go down my spine. I'm thinking, this is not a great coincidence of history. This has happened over and over and over. From the time they're little kids, people come up to them and say, when are you going to run for president of the United States? And it's that pressure and that expectation that kills and that hurts. And somehow we got to be a little easier on ourselves, a little more relaxed. And what I found in this study is that there's a very ambitious parent, and there's a child who's on the receiving end of that ambition. And there's another child, I call him the man in the shadows. There's a child in the shadows who's looking on with envy at this relationship between the anointed and the ambitious parent. And the ambitious parent's focus is all on this anointed child that's going to do these great things. And here's this other little child that's looking on. And again, it's not perfect, but again and again throughout the history of these presidential families, it's the child in the shadows who becomes the president. And the anointed child very frequently dies. Isn't that stark? But it's common again and again. Now it begins with Washington. Augustine Washington is dying. All his hopes, everything is on Lawrence. Lawrence gets Mount Vernon. Lawrence gets training in the ironworks. Lawrence gets the trip to England. Lawrence gets the education. Lawrence gets everything. And George is 11 years old. It's near his dad's bedside when he's dying, gets nothing. There's another child in between, another boy in between that gets education in England too as a backup. George gets nothing. But a few years after the death of Gus Washington, Lawrence Washington is dead too. And it's George, the boy in the shadows. I mean, it's true in the Eisenhower family. All the hopes in the Eisenhower family were on the baby, on Milton Eisenhower. He was the star. Dwight was nothing. And he just came out of the shadows. And he was a major. Dwight Eisenhower, in 1939, when World War II started, he was a major. He was a major. And in a few years, he's leading the whole Allied Armed Forces and then president. There's a scene in my book where Joe Kennedy's sitting, it's very cold, and Jack's out shaking hands, people coming out of the factory, and he's running for Congress, and Joe's warm in a car with a buddy, and he turns to his buddy, and he says, I never thought I'd see this in 1,000 years. I always thought it would be Joe. I always thought Jack was effeminate. I never thought he had it in him. I never thought I'd see it. They always thought it'd be Joe. And that's the man in the shadows. It's even biblical. I mean, in the story, there's a story in the Bible, and the prophet Samuel comes to Jesse, meets with Jesse. He's going to anoint one of his sons as the new king of Israel. And he meets all of them, and he says, I don't get it. Is that it? Is there anybody else? And Jesse says, nope. I mean, there's nobody else. I mean, these are my sons. Well, there's David. He says, well, go get him. I mean, it's the story of Moses and Aaron. You know, Moses says, don't you mean Aaron? Don't you mean Aaron? So it's the man in the shadows. And I got in a little bit of trouble over this because I made the point in my book that George W. Bush was, there are 5 generations of Bushes, and they all do the same thing. They move to a new state, get into a new industry, become a millionaire and a success without taking any money from their dad. Now, it's not cheating in the Bush arcane rules if you take money from a friend of your dad's, because you can't take it from your dad. So, they got a Bush that lives in New Jersey, and he's a success, and his son moves to Missouri and becomes a success in retailing. Who has a son who goes to Ohio, who founds Buckeye Steel in Columbus, Ohio, and becomes a millionaire in steel. Who has a son who goes to Connecticut, who becomes a millionaire in investment banking. It didn't take any money from his dad. When his dad died and left all this money in his will, he said, the sisters can have it. I don't want a dime from my father. Who had a son who went to Texas and got in the oil business. So you see, George W. was raised with 5 generations of that occurring. His dad has told me many times, I don't put any pressure on my children. Well, he didn't have to put any pressure on his children. He didn't have to say anything. He just had to tell them the family history. And George, he was a little boy living in Midland, Texas, when his dad became a millionaire, and they went from middle class. The very next year he went into a private school, Kincaid, in Houston, Texas, and the next year to Andover, and no wonder he didn't like it. His life was transformed at that adolescent age at that moment. He didn't like East Coast, and he didn't like people who think they're rich and people who think they're big shots, and he didn't like any of that. Because his normal life was transformed, and not only was it transformed, but his dad became a millionaire in Zapata oil right before his eyes, just like 5 generations prior had become. And my theory was that that's why he got into trouble, because he wanted out. I'm out.